This video is brought to you by Brilliant. On Sunday, Germany went to the polls to elect their federal government. As expected, the election was won by the centre-right Christian Democrats, which means that their leader Friedrich Merz will be the next Chancellor of Germany. So in this video, we thought we'd take a look at what Merz means for Europe and for the EU, and how he might mark a change from his predecessor Olaf Scholz. Explore which world leaders are winning and which are losing every week with our new podcast, The World Leader Leaderboard. Find it over on the TLDR Podcast YouTube channel or in your favourite podcast app. So perhaps the most important thing to understand about Sunday's election is that it was arguably the best conceivable result for Merz and the Christian Democrats. While the Christian Democrats had been ahead in the polls for quite some time, there were always two big open questions. First, whether they could protect their leader against the AfD, and second, whether they could win big enough to form a two-party coalition rather than a three-party coalition. Two-party coalitions have long been the norm in post-war German politics, but at the last election in 2021, the SPD, the Greens and the FDP decided to form a three-party coalition. As we've explained in previous videos, this didn't work out well for them, and Merz has since made it clear that he would much prefer a simpler two-party grand coalition with the SPD, which is what Angela Merkel had for most of her time in power. Anyway, the answer to both of these questions ended up being yes. The AfD underperformed the more optimistic pre-election polls, and the Christian Democrats and the SPD won enough seats between them to form a simple two-party coalition, in large part because both the FDP and the new Sarah Wagenknecht alliance fell just under the 5% vote threshold, and so received no seats in the Bundestag. Anyway, this is important for Europe for two reasons. First, the magnitude of Merz's success, plus the fact that the SPD had their worst result since 1887, means that Merz will be very much the dominant player in the coalition. And second, the fact that he only has to negotiate with the SPD and not some other third party means he's unlikely to have to make too many concessions, or end up stuck in a coalitional deadlock, like Scholz did. So what actually are Merz's plans for Europe? Well, the most pressing question at the moment surrounds Merz's foreign policy, especially when it comes to the US and Ukraine. While Merz was relatively measured about this during the campaign, the gloves came off once he'd won. At a roundtable immediately after the election, he said that US interventions in the German election, a clear reference to the Trump administration's active support for the AfD, were, quote, more outrageous than the interventions we have seen from Moscow, and called for, quote, independence from the US. This is astonishing in and of itself, not least because Merz used to be a committed Atlanticist, but it's also incredibly important from a European perspective because it means that the two biggest countries in the EU, France and Germany, are now singing from the same hymn sheet. French President Emmanuel Macron has long called for Europe to become more independent of the US, using the buzzword of strategic autonomy. But Olaf Scholz was always somewhat sceptical, which created a fair bit of tension with Macron. That Macron and Merz are apparently on the same page here makes it far more likely that the EU really will pivot away from the US in the next few years. As part of this, last week Merz suggested that the EU should begin discussions with the UK and France on nuclear sharing, or creating some sort of European nuclear umbrella. Similarly, Merz will also be a more hawkish supporter of Ukraine than his predecessor. Merz has signalled he would be open to sending Taurus missiles to Kyiv, something that Scholz has long opposed, and that he would accept raising NATO's spending target above 2% of GDP. The issue here for Merz is that it's not clear how he'd fund any dramatic increase in defence spending. The so-called debt brake, which limits Germany's deficit to just 0.35% of GDP, means he can't borrow more to fund it, and the German economy doesn't look strong enough to bear more austerity or tax hikes. Merz signalled an openness to reforming the debt brake during the campaign, but because it's constitutionally enshrined, this would require a 2/3 majority in the Bundestag. This might be difficult, given that the AfD and the Left Party together have more than a third of seats, and will probably oppose any increases in borrowing to fund further support for Ukraine. Anyway, another EU issue that Merz will have a real impact on is immigration. Merz has taken a pretty hard line against immigration domestically, but has also criticised the EU's immigration policies. He's described the EU's Dublin framework, which determines which EU country is responsible for processing an asylum application, as dysfunctional, and vowed to close Germany's borders on the first day of his tenure, effectively suspending the EU's Schengen Agreement. Merz's position on Schengen will be particularly disruptive. Schengen has come under increasing pressure recently as migration-skeptic governments have introduced more and more border controls. But as the largest recipient of asylum seekers, Germany closing its borders will both encourage others to follow suit and create real crises for its neighbours, who will suddenly have to deal with a significant increase in irregular immigration. Merz has also expressed support for migrant offshoring plans. He even flirted with using facilities built by the UK government for their controversial Rwanda scheme, which is something other EU states like Italy are trying to implement, and could perhaps now be done at the EU level. When it comes to green politics, Merz's coalition will be less green than its predecessor. While Merz has pledged to continue investment in renewables, where green policies come into conflict with economic growth, Merz has vowed to prioritise growth. This will put further pressure on the European Commission's Green Deal, which has already been watered down somewhat, and more aligns Merz with the farmers' movement in Europe. Merz has also taken a warmer tone towards nuclear energy, and while Germany is unlikely to restart its own reactors at this point, this is still important at the EU level, because Merz is more likely to sign off on EU support for nuclear power, which Scholz resisted. The final thing we thought we'd mention is Merz's position on joint EU borrowing, which has become a hot topic in Brussels recently, both because the EU now needs to decide how to pay off the 300 billion euros it borrowed during the pandemic and to fund support for Ukraine without the US. Now, instinctively, you might assume that Merz would resist this, as Christian Democrats have in the past. However, perhaps because he realises that it will be easier than reforming the debt brake, at the Munich Security Conference, Merz signalled he might be open to further joint borrowing to fund support for Ukraine, again putting him very much on the same page as Macron. All in all, Merz is probably good for Europe. Whatever you think of his politics, having a German chancellor who isn't hamstrung by coalitional infighting will give the EU more agency, especially given how much Merz and Macron apparently agree on. Now, the thing is, often in politics, we need to understand a wide variety of topics to truly understand what's going on. Unfortunately, our sponsor this week, Brilliant, helps us do just that, with thousands of lessons in maths, science, programming, and AI. And not only that, but their interactive lessons teach you by doing, instead of just asking you to mindlessly memorize stuff. This helps you build your critical thinking skills and to become a better thinker. For instance, Brilliant's newly updated maths courses help you establish a strong foundation in algebra. It then helps you build on this, teaching you how to conquer calculus, all while maintaining an emphasis on problem solving and reasoning. The thing I like best about this, though, is that their mathematical courses help you develop your mathematical intuition and fluency, skills that you can use in the real world. As we've told you before, data skills are absolutely necessary for navigating the modern world, and Brilliant is the best way to get them. To try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/TLDR or click on the link in the description. And by doing so, you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription.